I'm Jo Taylor. I'm the General Manager of Operations at the Paul Ramsay Foundation, because we've just had some more General Managers join us, so we're growing in number. And I would also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional land of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders, past and present, for their leadership, their persistence and their resilience. So it's a great pleasure to kind of formally welcome Daniel Lee. Thank you for coming all this way, Daniel. We all know it's very far to come. We hope you find it enjoyable. And Nicole Richards, who will, I hope, challenge and delight us with a conversation covering a range of topics, many of them familiar to the Paul Ramsay Foundation, such as what does system change look like? How do you collaborate effectively with the government? How do you tackle the root causes of disadvantage? And how do you operate in this current political climate effectively? And they've got just under an hour. So let's hope you can solve all those problems for us. Daniel is the Executive Director of the Levi Strauss Foundation, a corporate foundation based in San Francisco. The Levi Strauss Foundation advances pioneering social change in the area of HIV and AIDS, worker rights and well-being, asset building in low-income areas, and social justice in communities touched by the Levi Strauss business. When I had a look at what Daniel's been getting up to, I really enjoyed the fact that Daniel talks about our sector as being independent, nimble, and at its best, strategic, courageous, and highly responsive. When I Googled the foundation, the first thing that comes up is their commitment to courageous risks. And I'm hoping today we'll hear more about this. Not only what does courageous risks look like and feel like, but what does it mean when it works? And probably more importantly, what does it mean when it doesn't work? And to tease out Daniel's wisdom, we've got Nicole. Nicole Richards has helped share stories in the social sector for more than a decade across not-for-profit, private and public sectors, NGOs, trusts and foundations, state and federal government departments, and private corporations. So I think we're in really good hands here. And again, what I'm excited about is that Nicole talks about the value of sharing stories that aren't sugar-coated. Nicole believes that the authenticity of the story is critical to its impact, that we need more cautionary tales of missteps and strategies that go awry in philanthropy, which will make us more accessible and ultimately more effective. So that's my hope, as Sarah kind of challenged us today to talk about what our hopes and questions were. My hope is that in this conversation, we're going to learn from Daniel's experience about what works and what doesn't, and we'll be able to think how we can translate that and try it in Australia. Over to you, Nicole.
Jo. Thanks, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So you've heard a little bit of an introduction on Daniel Lee. I'd just like to flesh it out with a little bit more for context. So Daniel's the Executive Director of the San Francisco-based Levi Strauss Foundation. The foundation grants in the vicinity of $7.5 million each year in the areas of HIV/AIDS, human rights, social justice, workers' rights, and well-being. Advocacy and taking courageous risks, as we've already heard, are deeply ingrained features of the foundation's work, which includes supporting next-generation social justice leaders at the front lines of social change. In May this year, the foundation announced a $1 million commitment to support organizations that protect the civil liberties of highly vulnerable communities, including immigrants, refugees, the transgender community, and religious minorities. Also of equal interest is how Daniel came to be where he is today. Daniel is a child of refugees. Both his parents grew up in North Korea, fled to Seoul prior to the Korean War, and emigrated to the US. Daniel attended Princeton, initially as a physics major before being drawn to the historical study of early Christianity. This led to studies at Harvard Divinity School with hopes of either getting a doctorate or entering the helping professions, serving the LGBTQ community. Daniel went on to do fieldwork at a violence recovery program and helped fund an HIV/AIDS organization in Boston. After a brief stint as a travel writer, Daniel moved to California to take up a role at the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission doing human rights advocacy work with NGOs. In 2003, Daniel joined the Levi Strauss Foundation, initially as program manager for the Asia Pacific, based in Singapore. 4 years later, he moved to San Francisco's headquarters and became executive director of the foundation in 2009. Daniel has served on a range of boards, including the Council on Foundations, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and advisory boards of Global Fund for Women, Asian Law Caucus, and Horizons Foundation. Daniel's actually been a frequent visitor to Australia, and this is his 10th visit to our shores. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with a little bit of a chat about values, because the Levi Strauss Foundation, Levi Strauss & Co. was you've got a long backstory. The company was founded in 1853. The foundation was formed in 1952. But your founder was a very charitable man and set the tone for giving well before the foundation was formalized. There are 4 institutional values: originality, empathy, integrity, and courage. And these really do seem to be the signposts that guide the work of the foundation. You've spoken a lot about the continued pioneering spirit and being first in the face of tension. Can you tell us a little about that?
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone here for the warm welcome. It's been a tremendous delight to engage with folks here, and thank Philanthropy Australia for setting this table, and also acknowledge that we convene today on the ancestral lands of the Ngunnawal people, and let me pay homage to the elders, both past, present, and future. It's deeply meaningful, and it's great to hear that folks in Australia are acknowledging this heritage. When it comes to values, these values surfaced at Levi Strauss & Company long before I came 13 years ago, and that was a long time ago. I think they really show up at these moments of truth, and maybe we can go right to the jugular when since we're talking about philanthropy in turbulent times, and talk about this most recent U.S. election.
Please.
I wasn't alone in being very surprised about the election results, and at Levi's, we had a town hall meeting just 2 days after the election. Many of us had quite a hangover. And our CEO addressed questions from the audience, and really, I think, impressed me by his decisiveness. He actually has a former military background, and I think this bias towards action was something that really struck me. But he said that this is a time for Levi Strauss & Company to show the country and the world what it means to be driven by values. And he really emphasized, you mentioned originality, empathy, integrity, and courage. I think courage really stands out, and integrity. He also pointed to the fact that we as a company have long stood up for diversity, for equity, for inclusion, and really told a personal story about his own life, being married to an immigrant, and acknowledged that we are founded by an immigrant, Levi Strauss, who himself was a refugee. I'll talk a bit about that tomorrow. We're in a city built by immigrants. Our clothes have been sewn by migrants and immigrants. It's really what makes our company and our country great. So it was he that actually challenged the Levi Strauss Foundation, and we had a board meeting just 3 days later in the overhang of the election, saying what it is that we can do to live our values in these times. And he called upon us actually we had a special meeting that the board had 1 month into the new administration. He really wanted to ask the question, is Trump the candidate versus Trump the administration? And he said, is it bad, or is it not as bad as we thought? Bad or horrendous? And if there's a time for us to step up and live our values, let's separate fact from conjecture. So it led to quite a charge, I think, for our staff. The bias to action was there, and that's something about the corporate sector that there's an imperative to be responsive to the outside world, and I appreciate that from our CEO. We literally had a war room set up the second week of the administration, and as all the executive orders were coming in, we wanted to come up with recommendations that were based on reality and not on conjecture, because there's a lot of fear.
Sure.
I mean, we know that this administration, his playbook is very much about keeping large swaths of the U.S. population triggered and to stay a step ahead, whether through distraction or further triggering. But what we came to when we met on February 11th was recognizing that there are certain groups that we've long cared about as a foundation that stood in the crosshairs of the new administration's policies. So we really singled out, in particular, members of the transgender community. In particular, there was a group that we've long supported called the Transgender Law Center that had carried a series of legal clinics throughout the country and saw overwhelming demand for folks to have legal name changes so that their identity card matches their gender.
Right.
The recognition that they could be further abused by the medical system with the threats to the Affordable Care Act. Also the need for legal advice to get their records expunged by lawyers. So that was one group in the crosshairs. Definitely Muslims and South Asians, and with a Muslim travel ban happening soon after. Thirdly, immigrants, of course, and recognize that we're a city built of immigrants, and certain undocumented immigrants were particularly vulnerable. So based on that, our board was very decisive, and they approved a tranche of $1 million in grants to support these organizations. And among immigrants, really found organizations that had this track record of reaching the hardest to reach and the most vulnerable. So when you think of undocumented immigrants, what industries do they work in? Restaurant industry, domestic work, right? And students. So we found 3 exceptional organizations that had these very efficient delivery mechanisms that were able to get the right information to folks, often not in an organized sphere, could get legal aid to the right people, could get know your rights education. If there were raids by immigration and customs enforcement, could get that information out there. At the end of the day, we did this because we cared about these communities and do not want them to be left behind, and see them as a mainstay of really what's helped build our company in the city that we're in. And finally, Levi's is an American icon. And we really believe that as an American icon, what we say about America really matters. And I think this is a time where values are paramount. Are we an inclusive America? Are we a culture that embrace all that are born within it? Do we nourish all that are within it? Do we lift up the voices of those that are most marginal and ensure their participation in the issues affecting them? Or the other parts of the playbook are, do we separate, do we scapegoat, do we blame? So we called this informally our Inclusive America portfolio, and we really feel that it's an important time to put a stake in the ground of what this country is. And I believe in Australia there's many issues happening, and which Australia is each individual in here standing for, and likewise each foundation. So I think values are paramount, inclusion or not. And let me just say one other thing is that we funded social justice, folks who do advocacy. And part of it is because the San Francisco Bay Area is really it's a cauldron of innovation, both not only for technology, but for the justice sector. But the precedents that happen in the Bay Area, ripple across California and across the country. So we really believe it's been part of our character to fund advocates there. True to that character, it's been important to support those folks. Translating what social justice means across sectors, I think it's been something that's been in our genes, that we're a privately held company.
It's a nice pun.
Yeah, there's going to be some eye rolls along the way here. I'll use it again, okay? Give me some space.
Okay.
What was I saying?
Social justice?
Oh, social justice. We've been funding social justice leaders, and our board includes business leaders in the company, as well as family members who are the shareholders of Levi Strauss, the 5th and 6th generations descendants. And some of them have scratched their heads, like, I don't get what social justice means. What's the metrics we're trying to get at? What do they want to do? And in some ways, President number 45 has done us a favor in terms of drawing a very thick line with permanent marker about what social justice means and what it doesn't mean. And in many ways, the folks that we have been supporting day in and day out in the Bay Area community, we have a program called Pioneers in Justice. They were the first movers when these executive orders happened. And in many ways, these folks are tailor-made for these turbulent times. And it's like, okay, they were the ones inside SFO airport when the Muslim ban happened, providing legal aid to Afghani folks or to Syrians. They had the trust when folks are saying don't talk to folks. When their lawyers went in, people trusted them. These were good investments, and in many ways, by funding them day in and day out, it purchased an insurance policy for us as a foundation for these bad times, because they were already there. And it was our job to actually listen, ask where the needs were, and amplify. So I think in some ways this is a moment where that thick line with a permanent marker has been drawn, And different voices are coming out of the woodwork, and I'm really delighted that our company has taken that stand for an inclusive America. It's really fun. Yeah.
So I want to pick up the theme of corporate taking a stand, because obviously you have been in the business of that for some time now. And right now in the States, we're seeing some very high-profile CEOs abandoning the president's business advisory groups and openly rebuking his leadership or lack thereof. So Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation, who is also on the board of PepsiCo, was quoted in the New York Times recently saying, "This is a seminal moment in the history of business in America, where CEOs have taken the risk to speak truth to power." Do you think this is a new age of corporate leadership?
How many folks here represent corporate foundations or corporations? Okay, I'm gobsmacked by the numbers as far as the generosity of Australian corporations, 17.5 billion Aussie dollars.
We just heard that, yeah.
The US sector is 18.5 billion US dollars. So pound for pound, you all are punching way above your weight. My challenge is to match those dollars in the community with a corporate voice. First, a bit about Levi's. We've stood out long before it was the mold and the template, and I'm really delighted to see that many other corporations are changing the mold and the expectations. Just a few examples. Levi's desegregated factories in California and in the American South long before it was mandated by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We opened up factories in Virginia. The leadership says there's not going to be a line down the center. It's either going to be this way, open and inclusive, or not at all. It was the first company to adopt a code of conduct for a contracted supply chain back in 1991. And folks thought we were nuts that we would miss out on price if we had this set of standards. It was the right thing to do. And many other companies followed suit. And was the first company to respond to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. You know, what we've seen, just to give an example, in 2008, marriage equality was under consideration in California. Guess how many companies signed an amicus or a friend of the court brief to the California Supreme Court, talking about the economic benefits to the corporate sector of same-sex marriage? Guess how many? One. You're right. I wish I had a prize. I didn't have enough room in my suitcase. Apologies. Levi Strauss was the only one, and just fascinating to see 2015 when marriage equality is up for Supreme Court consideration. There were 378 companies that signed an amicus brief talking about the disadvantages of a fractured legal landscape from state to state. So that was a sea change. Somewhere between 2008 to 2015, we saw corporations stepping up. But since then, and the story hasn't been told globally, is we've seen a concerted backlash in the form, since marriage equality, that was 2 years ago, in the form of more than 300 anti-LGBT bills at the state level. And these are bills that, I mean, talk about bullying. Don't allow someone who's transgender to use the bathroom of their choice, okay, and paint them as a menace. These are bills that allow businesses, if they have faith beliefs, to not provide services to people based on religious belief. Some of these also discredited or overturned some anti-discrimination laws. And one trend that's been towering, and I've been an LGBT rights advocate for a long time, and it really surprises me that it's been businesses in places like North Carolina that put their business presence on their line. When Georgia, for example, had one of these pernicious anti-LGBT bills, it was businesses saying, we will not do business. We will not do business in the state, and threatening their presence. The Walking Dead. Has anyone watched that show? Next on AMC is The Walking Dead. It's a terrifying show, and just an engine of economic progress in Georgia. And there were other companies like Disney that did the same. In North Carolina, there were companies like PayPal, Braeburn Pharmaceuticals, and Salesforce that threatened to roll back expansions in their own businesses. And this is really a game changer. In Mississippi, with an anti-LGBT bill, Toyota and Nissan saying, this isn't where we want to do business. It's really good to see businesses putting their values on the line. Their consumers are calling for it. And I think we're seeing a new ethos and maybe more critical consciousness among consumers too. Bank of America is based in North Carolina, and they issued a rather tepid statement saying, oh, we decry this proposed anti-LGBT bill. they did not put their business presence on the line. And there were many community groups and consumer groups that rightfully said, why are you not stating that we demand that our headquarters be in a place that reflects our values? So it's good to see a winning out. So LGBT rights is one area. I think the Muslim travel ban was another game-changing moment.
Yep.
It was especially technology, the tech companies that were immediate and quick. And it's just really interesting to see that travel ban, which banned 7 or 8 folks from 7 or 8 countries from coming to the US. It was very nebulous. The response to that by foundations was rather meek and tepid, whereas corporations, which have, I think, a bias towards action because it's their employees, it's their impetus to have the greatest talent, and their consumers that are all calling for change.
Yep.
There was a reporter in The Verge magazine that actually ranked all the responses of the tech companies in terms of how swift they were, how sweeping they were, and whether they put their own voice and their business presence on the line. So Silicon Valley prides itself on quick execution. And I'm delighted to see that there's sort of a race to the top and to see these businesses like leading the way. And corporations are now, if you work in comms departments, the practice is to wake up at 3 or 5 in the morning to see if there's a tweet decrying your company. But I think it's really helped change the game to create these kinds of modes of resistance. And finally, most recently, we've seen, how many folks have heard about DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals? Should I give a quick explanation?
Please.
Okay, yeah. During the Obama administration, he put in a program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. There are 11 million undocumented people living in the United States. And there are many people who were brought into the United States as children in hopes of a better life. And they live in a bit of a stalemate. The DACA program, and there was an act called the DREAM Act, and this was all facilitated by folks called Dreamers, who advocated at the state level. They advocated to Obama to create some kind of solution where there was some pathway to them living their lives out. Without an identification card, you can't work, right? Or live out, you can't travel without ease. So the Obama administration created for folks under the age of 31 who completed kindergarten through high school, roughly, for 800,000 people that allowed them to apply for 2-year work permits. This program was really incredible, as far as allowing a solution for so many folks who are contributing to this country, who did their K through 12 education. So with the Trump administration then saying, we want Congress to continue this program, but we're going to discontinue it. It's really a double message. It's really hit sort of the root chakra of many undocumented students. And it's been, I think, tremendous to see many corporations at the forefront of, there were 500 corporations, including Levi Strauss, including many tech companies, that signed a letter to Trump immediately. And I think this drumbeat of advocacy will continue. And they're the ones showing the economic benefits. $460 billion of economic activity, because these folks who are DACA recipients, 65% have cars, 16% own homes. So it's great to see corporations putting their voices on the line. Hopefully we see more actually funding community movements too. So long answer, but
good answer.
These are some of the beach fronts of change that are happening.
Okay, so let's tackle the beast of advocacy.
Yep.
And there's been discussion in this room this morning where we've talked about power and influence, and there's concerns around that and whether or not there's too much influence from philanthropy. You, the Levi Strauss Foundation, 90% of your funding goes to underserved communities, and roughly 80% of that goes to advocacy. So I want to know how you define it, and in the past you've made some interesting distinctions between advocacy and lobbying, and how the foundation walks that line, particularly given so many of the issues that you're working on in terms of immigrant communities, refugees, even climate change is not just a political issue anymore, but a highly partisan issue.
Yes. Advocacy it's fascinating in our sector how advocacy is like, oh, we don't want to touch that. Oh, it's too controversial. Oh, it's political. Oh, it's going to get us in hot water. Advocacy is something all of us do every day. It's when somebody promotes an idea or a policy and tries to get other people to adopt it. Full stop. And it's based on this idea that social change can happen when laws and policies change. So it's an idea where you address systems. Yeah. You know, in the U.S., there's the laws are, I think the legal system is fairly similar to Australia's, and I understand, and we've heard this morning about how there's been some challenges and consultations around what advocacy means. But in the U.S. context, there's two no-nos. There's two no-nos, and I've actually understood that and if not, I'll be disabused of this tomorrow when we have our speaker that's going to talk more about this, the Australian law. The two no-nos, number one, you know, endorsing or opposing a political candidate, absolutely. In the U.S., one crosses over into lobbying if you actually mention a law. So you can, advocacy is we care about this political issue, we care about how it affects our communities, but law AB 624 is on the books, we encourage you to vote for it. That would be crossing over into lobbying, and that's a prohibited activity. So all the NGOs that we support are very savvy and understand that distinction. As I understand it, in Australia, you're actually able to name the law. So it's terrific. It's a land of opportunity. And I think that the parliamentarians really just blew me away. Some were advocates before, talking about advocacy as the lifeblood of democracy. That if you don't have, laws just don't appear overnight, and reform doesn't happen overnight. It's because people bring voices from the community, from folks who are directly impacted, and bring them to the table. I'm kind of stealing all the language for tomorrow's talk, which is good maybe, but it is a lifeblood of democracy, and I can't think of anything more profoundly democratic. And what's terrifying about that? Understood the vilification of certain environmental groups by these mining corporations, but the act of promoting an idea or a policy and saying this is what we care about and bringing voices from communities to the table, that's it. Yeah.
Lovely. So speaking of bringing those voices out, I mean, there's been a fair bit of discussion in recent years about the importance of citizen-centric philanthropy or citizen-centric approaches. That seems to be very fundamental to the work you're doing, especially with your the Pioneers program. And I just wondered, in terms of your value that you see in supporting, which you've mentioned a little already, supporting the grassroots social change leaders. And I'm also interested to know how the foundation works to offset the power imbalance between yourselves as the funders and your nonprofit partners.
I'll start with that question first, the power imbalance. I love the talks this morning that mentioned that we have a lot of power in our field. And I think there's something inherent about a power imbalance. But I think our job is, in as much as it's possible, to remove as many of those barriers. And I think if you ask if you ask NGOs what they really need, we have such mediated conversations. And what concerns me in times of austerity and in times of political turmoil, the thing that concerns me is community organizations feeling that they need to do these backbends in order to find out what is it the foundations want and to inflect what they do and what they say in those words. And if you simply ask someone, tell me what it's like to wake up. What are you grappling with? What's working well? What's not working well? And what do you need? That question has really drawn us to, I think, taking that core advantage of philanthropy, of doing what government can't, what other sectors cannot. I think, what did I say? We're nimble, we're independent, and strategic. Where we found that the greatest bang for the buck of our work comes from funding advocacy. And if you actually ask groups, what do you need that you can't do? Often they'll ask, is that really something you will consider? And I think to really ask ourselves the question, are we having the kind of conversations where the dreams that are being cradled by our grantees and the organizations that we support, are they visible to us in their full entirety? It's hard to have those conversations, but it requires humility. It requires, I think, an open ear, and also a lot of clarity. This is what we can do and what we can't do.
Right.
But again, foundations don't have to win a popularity contest, right? We don't have to get elected, right? We don't have to please consumers, and we don't have to please constituents,
Right.
or shareholders. And to me, I think it means let it rip as far as supporting bold advocacy from folks that we know. You know, and tomorrow I'll talk a bit about what makes a good advocate, because I feel that, you know, we come from a legacy of Levi Strauss as a pioneer. So I like to say in my line of work, we really know a pioneer when we see one. So we'll talk a bit more about that. I need something to say tomorrow, right?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Of course. Pace yourself. So you've also spoken, and I think this was in relation to the Pioneers program, so
Yeah.
if you want to pass, that's fine. But the importance of creating compelling narratives, particularly with your nonprofits.
Yeah.
Storytelling, obviously, kind of a big deal. How do you use it?
Well, first of all, I think when we listen to how social change works, it's people who not only get the policy plumbing, right, and not only know how to create programs that work, but they're the narrative crafters. How do you create that moral and political consensus of a change agenda?
Yeah.
It's one thing to be empowered, for example, as an LGBT person, and one thing to be empowered as a domestic worker. But there are certain folks who are worth their weight in gold, who are able to say, this is what's good for society. And to able to create those narratives that create that moral and political consensus. Bingo, those are the folks that we need to be supporting.
Yeah.
And we talked about advocacy capacity and building that. I thought it was amazing that parliamentarian talked about that. It's something that we spend a lot of time doing. We find good advocates and we find ways for them. Good advocates do what? They tell good stories of individual people. They color in those stories. They understand how laws and policies and practices create patterns, social patterns. And they really show how those social patterns affect lived lives, and they color in those spaces. And they're also good at mixing in data, because there are some folks in the business sector, for example, they need the hard data. It's that tapestry and understanding how to connect with people, whether, and I loved what the speaker said this morning about folks who bridge social capital versus bond social capital. We know folks who are good at talking to their base and the people who think like us. We believe that good pioneers and advocates take unlikely bedfellows as a new imperative. It's kind of kinky, right? And those who bridge and can code switch can understand what a life of a domestic worker is, and then speak to someone in Parliament to say, this is why we need a minimum wage. This is why we need a Bill of Rights for domestic workers. Those code switchers are the ones that we need to train. And there's always a role for philanthropy to be providing that advocacy capacity. And it was great to speak with Nick Moratis, who's here from Australian Progress, as one organization that's actually building advocacy capacity and is working a lot with advocacy organizations, and hope to see more conversations like this in the future on Philanthropy Australia. It is our work to equip folks for these kinds of moments of truth that appear. And it's being masters of framing, understanding how policy works, understanding how to code switch. Yep. Those are the skills of the day. And when we get involved with actually expanding our toolkit beyond grant making and actually fund some of that capacity building and even participate in it, that's when the fun begins of being sort of an engine of social change. So I encourage folks to widen their toolkit and actually observe these sessions, because we have a lot to gain from them too.
I wanted to talk about transparency with you, because it's another characteristic Levi Strauss Foundation embraces. You've got a publicly accessible online grants database, and you've spoken about the need in the past for foundations to come together and be strategic, not territorial. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to get good feedback, right? We never tell a bad joke, and we never eat a bad lunch. Well, sometimes we do tell bad jokes. To get real, robust feedback from grantees is a really hard thing. So it's been really important to look outside, to get outside-in feedback. I know we had the Foundation Center come in, previously, and I think what's been really useful with the Foundation Center is asking nonprofits what they need. And it's very simple. Like, is it transparent what you fund? Are the grants lists visible? And is it clear how to apply for a grant? I understand. How many here actually have open requests for proposals? Yeah? Great. That's wonderful to see, actually, because the trend is, in the US, and it really concerns me, maybe 70% or more are moving towards grants by invitation only. But folks are just, who are clamoring for resources need the information of what folks fund, just a contact person to get an idea in front of them, to send that one-page concept note, and to know how to apply. Those are the basic building blocks. I think the other pieces of transparency and serving the common good, I'm going to say a bit about that. I'm part of I'm on the board of an organization called the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. It's not a very sexy name. But what it is it's considered the leading watchdog to the philanthropic sector in the United States. What it does, and the board is half community organizers and leaders in the social justice community and half leaders in the foundation community. It's great to be unsettled, right? The idea is to take the best thinking of the nonprofit leaders, ask them what they need, ask what creates the most high impact work, and bring those insights to bear to drive the most effective philanthropy. And it's important to remember when money enters the coffers of our foundations, it is public interest money.
Yep.
Right? And how many folks feel like they have to manage up to their boards in a way? It's like, how do I get folks to understand that? Our board at the Levi Strauss Foundation are half members of the family who are descendants of Levi Strauss. They're very philanthropic, and half business leaders in the company. And what I think instructive about that, I can say maybe there's maybe the problem of many masters. So many folks to serve. I see some nods, but I actually consider it the blessing of many masters, because at the end of the day, it's not the family's money. They have their own, and they have their own philanthropies. They have about 12 family foundations. That can be their individual will. It's also not the company's money. But how do we serve the public good with a Levi-like stamp on it? That's the question I ask when we set the table. And it's been very important to look at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy's benchmarks. They pissed off a lot of folks by creating a set of benchmarks for philanthropy at its best. And at first glance, they sound really innocuous. But let me just delve into these a little. The first is donate 50% or more of your grants to underserved groups, okay? And has the widest possible conception of underserved groups. Women, minority groups, indigenous people, people with disabilities, elderly people, you name it, wide umbrella. It sounds like a no-brainer, right?
Right.
The truth is, I believe the Foundation Center data shows that 1 out of 3 grant dollars goes to underserved groups. The vast majority in the States goes towards universities, I think religious organizations, and to the arts. I think sort of the high-level arts. The truth of the matter is, guess what percentage of foundations meet this benchmark of 50% of the resources going to underserved groups? It's a pittance, 13%, right? So, we asked that question internally among our staff, and we did this accounting, and some of the staff said, why are we doing this? And it was really important to say we do this because we serve the public good, it's public benefit money, and we've really ratcheted that number up to 96% from 64% because we realize, what are we doing if we're not serving underserved groups? It's a very productive exercise. Another, I think, interesting benchmark is they recommend that 25% of all funding support advocacy, community organizing, advocacy.
So sorry, when you say they, that's the
Oh,
community?
the NCRP, yeah.
Right.
And because it's the most proven strategies at advancing justice,
Right.
and has a great bang for the buck. And we just, the encouragement is 25% of all foundations do this. Only 7% do. But those that do have really made a lot of waves. So I think that's a really sensible place to start. I'll say a little bit more tomorrow about sensible places to start. The other is to give flexible general operating support for 50% of your grants. And that's really taking good folks and allowing them to be flexible, to keep the lights on, to provide needs around staffing, and not just starve organizations with programmatic support. 16% of all foundations meet that 50% guideline. So we've ratcheted up our numbers to 50%. And our board chair was in the room, and we're like, well, it's really hard. We have these cycles, and we have, if we create general support grants or multi-year grants, that's another one there, it's going to mean less money it's going to be hard to look at our budgets. And our board chair said, excuse me, are we doing this for our own ease of administration? Or are we doing this to serve the community? And he's like, well, it's the latter. So it's been good I encourage folks to look at these NCRP criteria. I wrote an article actually a while back about how our foundation used it, but we need to bring outside in insight on how we can serve the public good. Those are such simple no-brainers.
Yes. I want to peel back the transparency an extra layer.
Okay.
Because philanthropy is usually terrible at sharing stories of failure. And I wonder if you would take a courageous risk with us and tell us about a failure.
All right. Well, a big focus of our foundation ever since our founding has been on advancing the rights and the well-being of workers in our supply chain. And our company owns and operated our own factories in the American South up through the 90s. And then, when we had our contracted supply chain, our foundation had a big part in taking some of the insights in empowering workers in the American South when we owned and operated our own factories to our contracted supply chain. So I'd say between around 1997 and 2007 or so, we donated about $8 million to advance the rights and the well-being of apparel workers in our supply chain in about 12 key sourcing countries. Mm-hmm. These are places like Cambodia, India, Pakistan, Haiti, Cambodia. And this created a lot of good in the sense that we brought NGOs, nonprofits, on the factory floor. They trained workers so they could read their pay stubs, trained workers so they understood their rights under the law, mm-hmm. and understood what labor standards were. Because we have to understand that throughout the apparel industry, apparel workers are typically women, young women, about 70%, age 17 to 25, and they're migrants from countryside areas entering wage labor for the first time. And they're entering these burgeoning cities like Dhaka and Phnom Penh in Cambodia, without a lot of knowledge of the cities that they're in, mm-hmm. about what it means to enter labor, and they're moving their families, and they often have children, and they're often leaving their children back home. So also providing education about reproductive health, and education about basic health and hygiene. There were some positives there in the sense that we, I think, built a well of trust where in these countries, many of these factory owners saw nonprofits, NGOs as a whole, as troublemakers. Oh, they're going to come in, they're going to look at labor standards here, and they're going to create a campaign. And we really helped build that well of trust to understand they can be productive partners on the factory floor and build a better workplace. But here's the rub. Out of that 12 years, guess what percentage of those grants were actually were continued by those factory owners after our funding left? Sorry? 2, that's even higher than you're giving us credit. 0. Maybe 1 or 2. And that basically amounted to some really good intention factory-based charity, right?
Right. And
it was one and done. And given that turnover is often 13% a month in one in one factory, workers go to another factory for $2 more per month. We realized that there were immense benefits to apparel workers, and there are also benefits to the workplace. And we know, all of us know, I think intuitively, that what's good for workers is good for business. And that we build our lives because we have comps and benefits, and they're out of a competitive context. We have sick leave, we have medical benefits, et cetera. So the 20th anniversary of our company starting the first terms of engagement, the first code of conduct, happened around 2011. And we really just said, have these codes of conduct, which are sets of thou shall nots, right, over time. Chemical safety, fire safety, environmental standards. Are they really getting at the improvements that we were seeking this is kind of a failure too, to improve the lives of workers who are making our products, to ensure that they have better lives? And the answer for both of these grants and are looking at the whole world of codes of conduct and compliance and this policing. One factory in China can get monitored 25 times in 1 year, and they'll still have double books. They'll still have harassment and discrimination. So we then realized the answer was really under our noses around how we can better improve the lives of workers. We have these great worker empowerment programs. We just weren't integrating them as a way of doing business. So we really said we want to create a new standard that we called improving worker well-being. That's built on this premise that's what's good for workers is good for business. And really get our factory owners to embrace these worker empowerment programs, not as a one-off and not like, oh, the brand is telling us to do one other thing, but as part of creating a better workplace. And the unlock for us was an ROI study, which showed that for every $1 put into women's reproductive health training on the factory floor, there were $3 to $4 of benefit. And let me explain why that happened. These are women, right, age 17 to 25, with very limited knowledge about the changes that are happening in their lives or their bodies. So we found, this ROI study in Pakistan and Egypt found that women were skipping work for 3 days a month during their monthly menstrual cycles. They didn't have knowledge that they could take a painkiller and work through, didn't have access to sanitary napkins. So by having peer-to-peer education, access to sanitary napkins, and access to a painkiller, it actually created an ROI of 615 workdays. Absenteeism plummeted by 24%. The women who took the maximum number of sick days per month plummeted by 45%. So that was really an ROI to show that what's good for workers is good for business. So we now have, we piloted this in 5 really difficult sites. And we really believe that this is our next sort of thrust at improving standards in the industry. We really want to create not just a compliance as this floor, but make good for workers, good for business part of the work that we do. So all of our key suppliers, that's just about 80% of our business by 2020, are being required now to survey workers about their well-being needs. And we created an open source survey to roll out programs that benefit the health and well-being of workers that are based on data and need, not based on conjecture, to actually build management systems around this so that they're sustained, and also measure the business benefits and the social benefits, because unless they see the savings, it's not going to be continued. And it's really created a whole new way of working with our supply chain, and it's now a requirement, and we really hope that this will create a chain in teaching and learning that other brands, other suppliers will realize that rampant turnover is not a good thing, but if you actually help workers build their lives, they will stay and create a better workplace.
And so this is something that you will share as well? With
actually, if you read Fortune magazine, there's actually a profile on worker well-being. We spent 4 years piloting it, and it's been about the last year and a half rolled out in our supply chain. And we've reached 50% of our supply chain. We're working with Harvard University to create sort of a impact assessment so that a supplier will have their own gauge of what specific well-being interventions will have direct through lines to absenteeism, to turnover, et cetera, to things that have impact on the factory floor. So this is, if you look at the Fortune magazine, what is it, Ideas That Change the World? There was a profile on this in a Mexican factory.
Okay.
So I'll give you a chance to read more about that. But this really came out of 2 failures. We realized that compliance wasn't working, and these one-off worker rights grants, which were sort of put on as an imposition, weren't getting at that impact.
Okay.
So we're trying to create good HR, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
We're at time.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, already. I wanted to ask you briefly, what is the message that you leave with the funders and policymakers that are here today?
Well, I think the message has been said so well. I was amazed by having parliamentarians who are former advocates, putting it out there that if we are not, actually, I'm going to give you a quote about philanthropy. I want to go back to Joe's quote from the morning about philanthropy means love of humankind. Okay, and let me just add a little bit of insight to that. by the greatest American in a quote. And some of you might have heard this, that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power without love is reckless and abusive. And he goes on to say, power is at its best love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So if our work is about love of humankind, it is our work to discern the fault lines of justice, to see those and to serve those with the least wealth, opportunity, and power. Cornel West is a very famous academic, and he paraphrases by saying, justice is what love looks like when it shows up in public. So my last word is that advocacy fuels the power of justice. And if we're not fueling the power of justice, what the hell are we doing? Excuse my language. Thanks.
Forever. So you can hear more from Daniel. There are several more Philanthropy Australia events happening at the end of this week in Sydney, and also keep an eye out for more of Daniel's personal story. He'll be appearing on the ABC TV show 1+1. Thank you again, Daniel. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.